the icy waters of the Pacific Northwest hold secrets that are darker than the deepest trenches of the ocean floor. Along the rugged coastline of Vancouver Island lies a stretch of treacherous water known to sailors as the graveyard of the Pacific. It is a place where the mist clings to the water like a suffocating shroud, and the jagged rocks lie in wait like the teeth of a submerged leviathan. For centuries, this unforgiving expanse has claimed ships and souls with indiscriminate cruelty, leaving behind nothing but splintered wood and haunting legends. Among these tales of maritime tragedy, one story stands out for its sheer horror and the spectral legacy it left behind. It is the story of the SS Valencia and the doomed souls who haunt its wake. Imagine standing on a rocky precipice, overlooking the churning gray waves as the wind howls like a banshee through the ancient spruce trees. The year is 1906, and the world is on the cusp of a new era of technology and travel. Steamships are the marvel of the age, connecting cities and transporting dreamers across vast distances. Yet no amount of steel or steam can tame the primal fury of the ocean when the weather turns foul. The story of the Valencia is not just a tale of a shipwreck. It is a descent into a nightmare where the line between the living and the dead becomes terrifyingly thin. It is a narrative of desperation and madness, and a haunting that refuses to fade with the tide. The SS Valencia was an iron-hulled passenger steamer that had seen better days by the time she embarked on her final voyage. Built in 1882, she had served the coastal routes for years, carrying passengers between San Francisco and the cities of the north. She was a sturdy vessel, but she was not designed for the brutal winter storms of the northern Pacific. On that fateful January day, she carried a diverse group of people. There were wealthy businessmen and families seeking new lives, and weary travelers returning home. None of them could have known that they were stepping onto a floating coffin. The atmosphere on the docks of San Francisco was one of routine bustle, but a dark omen seemed to hang in the air. Captain Oscar Johnson was the man in command of the Valencia. He was a seasoned sailor, but his confidence would soon be tested against the merciless elements. As the ship pulled away from the wharf, the sun may have been shining in California, but far to the north, a storm was brewing that would swallow the sky. The passenger list included over 100 souls, ranging from innocent children to hardened laborers. They settled into their cabins and watched the Golden Gate fade into the distance. For many of them, it would be the last time they ever saw land that was not a jagged trap of death. The journey began with the mundane rhythm of life at sea, but that rhythm was about to be shattered. As the Valencia steamed northward, the weather began to deteriorate with alarming speed. The blue skies turned a bruised purple, and the gentle swells grew into towering mountains of water. By the time the ship reached the waters, off Cape Mendocino. The wind was screaming through the rigging. Visibility dropped to near zero as a thick, blinding fog rolled in to join the gale. Captain Johnson and his crew were navigating by dead reckoning, a method that relied heavily on estimated speed and direction. In these chaotic conditions, however, estimates were nothing more than hopeful guesses. The ship was pushed off course by the strong currents, and the howling winds drove her closer to the treacherous shore. The mood on board shifted from boredom to anxiety as the ship pitched and rolled violently in the tempest. Passengers who had been enjoying meals in the dining saloon now retreated to their cabins, clutching their rosaries and praying for deliverance. Plates smashed against the bulkheads, and furniture slid across the decks. The sound of the ocean was a deafening roar that drowned out all conversation. Below deck, the engines strained against the force of the waves, but the Valencia was losing her battle against the sea. She was blind and deaf in a chaotic void, steaming full speed ahead into a trap that had been set by geography and bad luck. It was late in the evening of January 22nd when the disaster struck with the force of a thunderclap. The ship had missed the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca by nearly 50 miles. Instead of sailing into safe harbor, she was driving straight toward the unforgiving reefs of the West Coast Trail. Through the gloom and the spray, the lookouts saw nothing until it was too late. With a sickening screech of tearing metal, the Valencia slammed onto the rocks at Pashina Point. The impact threw passengers from their bunks and sent a shockwave of terror through the vessel. The lights flickered and died, plunging the ship into absolute darkness save for the flashes of lightning. Panic erupted instantly. The sound of rushing water filled the lower decks as the ocean poured into the wounded hull. Screams of terror mixed with the howling wind, creating a cacophony of despair. Captain Johnson ordered the engines reversed in a desperate attempt to pull the ship free, but the jagged rocks held her fast. The Valencia was pinned against the cliff face, trapped between the pounding surf and the vertical stone wall. The waves crashed over the stern, sweeping away anything that was not bolted down. In the chaos, families were separated, and the order of civilization collapsed into a primal struggle for survival. The crew attempted to launch the lifeboats, but the severe list of the ship and the violence of the storm made the task nearly impossible. The first boat was lowered erratically, and before it could reach the water, it capsized, spilling its occupants into the freezing churn. Their cries were silenced almost instantly by the crushing waves. A second boat met a similar grim fate. It was smashed against the side of the ship by a massive swell, turning the wooden craft into splinters and sending more souls into the dark abyss. The horror of the scene paralyzed those remaining on deck. To stay was to die, but to leave seemed to be a guarantee of a faster death. For the next 36 hours, the survivors clung to the rigging and the upper superstructure of the wreck. They were drenched by freezing spray and battered by the relentless wind. The ship groaned and shuddered with every wave threatening to break apart at any moment. From the high cliffs above the wreck was invisible in the fog, but the sounds of the tragedy drifted up to the forest. It is said that the indigenous people and the few settlers in the area could hear the screams carried on the wind, a ghostly chorus of agony that chilled them to the bone. The Valencia had become a stage for a slow and agonizing demise. Rescue ships were dispatched as soon as the news of the wreck reached the mainland. The Queen and the city of Topeka arrived on the scene, but the conditions were too ferocious for them to approach the stricken vessel. They could see the shadowy outline of the Valencia and the tiny figures clinging to the rigging, but they were helpless to intervene. The gap of water between the rescuers and the dying was a chasm of death that no boat could cross. The survivors watched in anguish as their potential saviors stood by, unable to bridge the few hundred yards that separated life from death. It was a torture of the soul that matched the torture of the body. As the hours dragged on, hypothermia began to claim the weakest. Children froze in their mothers' arms, and strong men lost their grip and tumbled into the foam. The scene on the deck was one of absolute desolation. In a moment of profound sorrow and defiance, the remaining passengers began to sing. Above the roar of the storm, the haunting melody of "Nearer, My God, to Thee" rose into the gray sky. It was a funeral dirge sung by the living, a final plea to the heavens before the end. The sound of that hymn, sung by doomed voices in the midst of a hurricane, remains one of the most chilling images in maritime history. The end came with brutal finality. The battering of the waves finally broke the ship's back. The main mast collapsed, taking with it dozens of people who had lashed themselves to the structure for safety. The hull disintegrated, and the Valencia slipped beneath the surface, leaving only a field of debris and struggling swimmers. Most were dashed against the rocks or pulled under by the undertow. There was no mercy in the graveyard of the Pacific that day. Out of the 108 people on board, only 37 men survived. Not a single woman or child made it to the shore alive. The loss was total and devastating. The aftermath of the disaster was grim. Bodies washed ashore for weeks, lining the beaches like driftwood. The rescuers who combed the coastline found scenes of unspeakable tragedy. Mothers were found clutching their infants in death, and friends were tied together in a final embrace. The wreckage of the Valencia was scattered for miles, a testament to the violence of her destruction. But even as the dead were buried and the inquiry began, strange stories started to circulate among the locals and the sailors who frequented those waters. The Valencia, it seemed, was not ready to rest. The first signs of the haunting appeared shortly after the wreck. Fishermen passing near Pashina Point reported seeing strange lights hovering over the water where the ship had gone down. These were not the bioluminescent glow of sea life, but steady, unnatural lights that resembled the portholes of a steamer. Some claimed to hear the sound of a ship whistle, blowing frantically in the fog, even when no vessels were in the area. The locals who knew the coast best avoided the site at night, speaking of a heavy feeling of dread that settled over anyone who ventured too close. Years passed, but the legends grew stronger. In 1910, a group of mariners made a chilling discovery. They found a lifeboat floating in a sea cave near the wreck site. It was in pristine condition, covered in green moss, but otherwise undamaged. The name painted on the bow was Valencia. The strange part was that the lifeboat had been missing for 4 years. Yet it looked as though it had been waiting in that cave, untouched by the rot of the ocean. When they tried to tow it away, the boat reportedly became incredibly heavy, as if invisible hands were holding it back before it suddenly broke free. The most famous and terrifying encounter occurred in 1933, 27 years after the disaster. The crew of the steamer accompanying the lighthouse tender was navigating the same treacherous waters when they saw something impossible. Ahead of them, in the thick fog, a ship emerged. It was a black-hulled steamer pouring black smoke from its funnels. As it drew closer, the crew could clearly see the figures of people on the deck, clinging to the rigging. The ship was the Valencia, moving silently against the current. The phantom vessel rode the waves with an eerie stability before dissolving into the mist, leaving the crew shaken and pale. This was not an isolated incident. Over the decades, numerous reliable witnesses reported seeing a phantom ship along the West Coast Trail. Sometimes it appeared as a fully formed vessel, while other times it was a spectral shadow in the fog. Hikers on the trail, which was originally built as a life-saving route for shipwreck victims, often report the sensation of being watched from the water. Some have described seeing a lifeboat rowing furiously through the surf manned by skeletal figures who never reach the shore. The rowing continues endlessly, a Sisyphean struggle against a spectral tide. One particularly harrowing account came from a local fisherman who was caught in a sudden squall near the wreck site. He claimed that as the waves rose around his small boat, he saw a lifeboat cresting a swell nearby. Inside, he saw rowers with pale, gaunt faces and hollow eyes staring directly at him. He shouted to them, offering help, thinking they were survivors of a recent accident. But as his boat drew near, the figures did not respond. They simply continued their silent mechanical rowing until the lifeboat faded into the transparency of the water, vanishing right before his eyes. The West Coast Trail itself is steeped in the energy of the disaster. The trail winds through dense rain forest and along high cliffs directly overlooking the site of the tragedy. Hikers often report unexplained phenomena near the area known as the Valencia Bluffs. Compass needles spin erratically, and strange mechanical sounds are heard emanating from the rocks. There are spots where the birds refuse to sing, and a profound, unnatural silence hangs heavy in the air. It is as if the land itself remembers the trauma and holds onto the imprint of the suffering that occurred there. In the 1970s, a diver attempted to explore the remains of the Valencia, which lie submerged in shallow but turbulent water. He described the underwater scene as the most unsettling environment he had ever entered. The twisted metal of the hull loomed out of the murky green water like the ribs of a giant beast. He reported feeling sudden, unexplained drops in temperature and the distinct sensation of being pulled downward. At one point, he saw what looked like a face peering out from a rusted porthole. But when he swam closer, there was nothing but darkness and silt. The legend of the ghostly lifeboats is perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Valencia mystery. It is said that on the anniversary of the sinking, if the fog is thick enough, one can still see them. They appear as gray shapes in the mist, gliding silently over the black water. The rowers are described as skeletons clad in the tattered rags of Edwardian clothing. They row toward the shore, desperate to land, but the currents of the afterlife keep them forever adrift. It is a visual echo of the despair felt by the passengers in their final hours. Another chilling element involves the shoreline itself. Beachcombers have reported finding objects that seem to have washed up from the past. A child's leather shoe perfectly preserved, a silver hairbrush tarnished black by the sea. These artifacts appear after storms, as if the ocean is vomiting up the remnants of the lives it stole. Those who find these objects often report a feeling of intense sadness or sudden nausea, compelling them to leave the item where it lies. To take a souvenir from the Valencia is considered to be an invitation for bad luck. The ghost of the young girl is another specific apparition associated with the wreck. Witnesses have described seeing a small girl in a white dress standing on the rocks at the base of the cliff. She stands motionless, staring out at the sea as the waves crash around her feet. When people try to approach her or call out to warn her of the rising tide, she simply vanishes into the spray. Legend says she is waiting for her parents, who were lost when the main mast collapsed, separated from her in the chaos of the sinking. The psychological toll on the survivors of the original disaster was immense, and many believed they were haunted for the rest of their lives. One survivor, Frank Bunker, spoke of nightmares that never ceased. He claimed that he could hear the singing of the hymn in his sleep every night for decades. He believed that a part of his soul had remained on that ship, trapped in the cold metal carcass beneath the waves. This psychological scarring suggests that the haunting is not just of the place, but of the people who were touched by the tragedy. Even modern technology has picked up anomalies in the region. Marine radar systems on passing vessels sometimes show a blip where no ship exists. The signal is solid and distinct, indicating a large metal object moving at the speed of a steamship. When the crews look out the bridge windows, there is nothing but empty ocean. These ghost targets appear and disappear near Pashina Point, confounding captains, and adding a layer of technological verification to the old maritime legends. The graveyard of the Pacific has claimed countless ships, but none have lingered in the collective consciousness like the Valencia. It serves as a reminder of human fragility in the face of nature. The story operates as a cautionary tale, a dark parable about the hubris of believing we can conquer the elements. But beyond the moral lesson, there lies the undeniable reality of the unexplainable. The consistent reports from unconnected witnesses over more than a century suggest that something truly supernatural is at play. Some paranormal researchers believe that the intense emotional energy released during the prolonged suffering of the passengers imprinted itself on the environment. This is known as a residual haunting, a recording of a tragic event that plays over and over again. The singing of the hymn, the screams in the wind, and the sight of the phantom ship are not conscious spirits, but echoes trapped in the fabric of time. However, the interactive nature of the lifeboat sightings, where the figures stare at witnesses, suggests something more intelligent and malevolent. The isolation of the location adds to the horror. To reach the site, one must hike for days through difficult terrain or approach by boat across dangerous waters. This isolation preserves the energy of the site, preventing the noise of the modern world from washing it away. It is a sanctuary of sorrow, a cathedral of salt and stone dedicated to the memory of the lost. In this quiet corner of the world, the dead are not silent. They are waiting to be heard by anyone brave or foolish enough to listen. As night falls over the West Coast Trail, the atmosphere changes perceptibly. The shadows lengthen and the forest seems to close in. Campers near the bluffs often report trouble sleeping, plagued by vivid dreams of drowning and suffocation. They wake gasping for air, with the taste of salt water in their mouths. It is as if the boundary between the dreamer and the drowned is permeable, allowing the terror of 1906 to seep into the present night. There are those who say that the Valencia is not just a ghost ship, but a collector of souls. They believe that those who die in the vicinity of the wreck are added to the phantom crew, doomed to row the spectral lifeboats for eternity. This grim folklore keeps many locals away from the area after dark. They respect the ocean, and they respect the dead, knowing that there are forces in the world that are beyond understanding, and certainly beyond challenging. The tragedy also led to major changes in maritime safety, including the construction of the Pashina Point Lighthouse and the improvement of the life-saving trail. But no lighthouse beam can cut through the spiritual darkness that shrouds the wreck site. The light sweeps across the water, continuously, a mechanical guardian trying to ward off a danger that is already past. Yet in the intervals of darkness between the beams, the phantom ship is said to sail immune to the warning light. In the end, the story of the SS Valencia is a testament to the enduring power of tragedy. It is a story that combines the brutality of nature with the mystery of the supernatural. The image of the iron ship battered against the rocks, while the passengers sang their final hymn, is etched into the history of the Pacific Northwest. It is a picture of profound dignity in the face of hopeless horror, and the image of the ghostly lifeboats rowing forever in the mist is the lingering scar that refuses to heal. If you ever find yourself walking the West Coast Trail and you look down at the churning waters of the Pacific, remember the Valencia. Listen closely to the wind, and you might hear the faint strains of an old hymn. Look into the fog, and you might see the outline of a steamship that should not be there. But do not linger too long, and do not call out to the figures in the water, for the ocean is deep, and the dead are lonely, and they are always looking for new passengers to join them on their eternal voyage to nowhere. The sea keeps its secrets well, but it never truly lets them go. The Valencia remains down there in the crushing dark, slowly turning to rust. But its spirit is restless. It is a phantom wound in the geography of the coast, a place where the barrier between our world and the next has been shattered. So tread lightly on those cliffs and keep your eyes on the trail. In the graveyard of the Pacific, the past is never truly dead. It is just waiting for the fog to roll in.